Imagine you've just finished building an app, but when you run the app, you realize it doesn't look good on different screens, such as tablets and desktops. And that's because your app is not responsive. It doesn't automatically adjust to different screen sizes as it should. Of course, you might simply dismiss this issue, thinking that if it doesn't work on other screens, the user can always use it on their phone and be done with it. But that would be foolish, since one of the biggest advantages of FlutterFlow and Flutter is being able to build the app once and have it work on different devices. Fortunately, it's fairly straightforward to build apps that work on any device from the ground up. And in today's video, I will tell you exactly how you can build your apps the right way. Now, Flutter's layout mechanics are rather complicated, but because I've been doing Flutter for so long, I'm able to distill it in some important rules that you guys need to understand. And so it's very, very important for you guys to understand what I'm about to tell you, okay? It's gonna make your life a lot easier, okay? So the golden rules of FlutterFlow or Flutter's layout, okay? So the parent sets constraints for its children. The children set their own size, and the parent sets position. Okay, so there's a bunch of things here that I want to kind of unpack. Okay, so if we scroll down, we see kind of a widget tree. So if you recall, in FlutterFlow and in Flutter, everything that you see on the screen is a widget. Okay, so you might have, a page widget, a button widget, a text widget, etc., etc. And so when we talk about parents and children, we are talking about, widgets that have other widgets as part of them, right? So for instance, you might have a row here, and that row might have a text and a button as children of the row. So it's very, very important. Okay, so children set their own size. So these children right here, they can set whatever size they want, but it needs to respect the constraint that the parent sets. Okay, and so this is very important. So what I want you guys to get, the takeaway that I want you guys to have is that the parent tightly controls how its children will appear. Constraints are more powerful than mere size, right? So size is important. It's nice that, the children can set their own size, but constraints are so much more powerful. Okay, so this is, the one takeaway that I want you guys to have. Okay, and so what this means is that different widgets have different rules for their children, right? And this is where we are going to jump into different scenarios. And now you're going to start to see how you can, get your app to align itself exactly as to how you want it, right? So for different resolutions, for different scenarios, right? This is where it all begins. So there are four kind of general scenarios, okay? So we have a situation where a parent is forcing a specific size, okay? So one example is something called a scaffold, which is the main page, okay? So when you start your FlutterFlow app, you have that main page, and the child needs to expand to that main page. Okay, so this is just one scenario, right? A child must adopt the specific size set by the parent. Okay, so the outcome is that the child exactly matches the size specified by the parent. And so in this scenario, the parent is being very, very strict. It's being very, very forceful. It's not, telling the child, hey, you can do whatever you want. It's telling it, you cannot do whatever you want. You're going to do exactly what I say. Okay, so this is one scenario. The next scenario is that we have a parent with fixed constraints. Okay, and so what this means is that it basically tells it, okay, these are the constraints that I'm giving you, and you have to respect those constraints. Okay, it's a little less strict than this, where this is like specific size. Okay, and so an example is something called an expanded widget and a container with a width and height. And we're going to be covering all of this a little bit later in the video. This is all very, very important. So the behavior is a child must fill all available space, and a child matches the size dictated by the parent. Okay, so we're going to be talking about this scenario. This is a very, very common scenario. Next, we have a parent with flexible constraints. Okay, so now we're becoming a little bit less strict, a little bit more flexible. Okay, so an example is a container with width and height constraints. Okay, so we're not talking about a container with specific width and heights, right? We're talking about constraints now. We're not talking about a size. And also there's something called a flexible with a flex value of 1. And this is something that we're going to be covering as well a little bit later in the video. This is very, very powerful, and it's kind of related to this expanded. And so the behavior is a child can choose its size within the given range. Okay, so we're being a little bit more flexible, but we're still telling a child how to, how to behave. A child sizes itself within the constraints provided by the parent. And last but not least, we have the most flexible, the less strict scenario. And this is a no specific constraint from the parent. So parent allows full flexibility. Okay. Child determines its size based on its own content and preferences. Child sizes itself to fit its content or intrinsic size preferences. Okay, so this is a scenario where the parent doesn't care. It says you can be as big as you want, you can be as small as you want. I don't care. Okay, and we're going to be talking about this scenario as well, because you're going to be dealing with this scenario all the time. And I can already guess that you probably dealt with this scenario, and you may have already had issues in this scenario, right? And so just to sum up, right, the main takeaway is that the parent tightly controls how its children will appear. Constraints are more powerful than mere size. This is kind of what I want you guys to remember from all of this here. Okay, so now that we kind of talked about the main rules, let's jump into FlutterFlow so that you can see all of these rules in action and how they help to make your app responsive. All right, so here I have created a sample proof of concept app that will show you the different ways that you can influence how your app ultimately looks, right? The different ways that you can influence the layout of your app, okay? And this is how you will learn to make your app responsive. Now on this first screen here, I want to show you different scenarios here, okay? So right now we are looking in the mobile view here, okay? And as you can see, we already have a couple of issues. We can see hello James, but we cannot see the full text here, okay? We cannot see, it should say welcome to your dashboard, I guess, but we can't see it. But if we go into the tablet view, we can see it, okay? It says welcome to your dashboard, and you can see the layout has changed a little bit, right? So if you go into the desktop view, it changed a little bit as well. And so if we go back to our mobile view, we have an issue here, okay? Now, why do we have this issue? Well, and by the way, the app that you're viewing right now, you'll be able to get complete and unrestricted access by becoming a member of our amazing Patreon community, which you can learn more via the link in the description of the video. Take a look here. These are all rows. This is a row here, okay? And inside the row, we have some text. Now, when you're dealing with rows and columns, okay, you're going to be dealing with something called a flex, right? Rows and columns are flex widgets, right? They're flex compatible widgets. And what this means is that if you're inside of a row, right? I'm talking about directly inside as a direct child, not like a grandchild or further down the tree, right? A direct child, right? If you select a widget that's a child of a row, you're going to have this expansion. You're not going to see this expansion in other scenarios, okay? And what this allows you to do is it allows you to set various constraints on these fields, okay? Now, as I mentioned a little bit earlier in the video, there are some widgets that do not assign any constraints, right? That last scenario that we talked about. And row is one of those widgets, right? So row does not, does not care about, what the size should be of the widgets. You can be as small as you want, you can be as large as you want. It does not, create any constraints, right? It does not enforce any constraints. And as a result, if we have this text here, this text is fine, but this text here, it's too long. Now, row doesn't care, But if you run our app, so if I'm going to go ahead and run our app, we're going to have an issue here. And so here's this view here. And the issue we have is because row does not care about the size. If you make it long enough, row is not going to complain. But as a result, it's not going to be displayed and Flutter is going to complain, right? Because we have an overflow issue. Now, if we click here, we no longer have that issue because we have a wider screen resolution. We have a wider screen size. So in this case, it gets displayed fine, right? And same thing for desktop. It gets displayed fine. We have another issue here, but we'll get to it in a little bit. But right now, you can see that this issue comes up here only, okay? So how do we fix it? Well, the way we fix it is by doing an expansion, right? So remember, this field here is a direct child of row, which means that we have this expansion capability. So we can click here, and what that's going to do is that's going to establish a constraint. It's basically going to say, you can take up the whole space that you have, okay? And it's going to do it in a way where it's going to be displayed. There's not going to be an overflow because we're not, we now have constraints, right? We're telling it take up as much space as you need, but that doesn't mean overflow, right? It means take up the space, but without having the overflow. And as a result, this is kind of what we have. And if we restart this app, we're not going to have this overflow on top anymore, right? Because we've set a constraint on a child of a row because the row does not set any constraints at all. So we need to set our own constraints. And so if we jump back here, you see now this is displayed correctly here. And so this is the first thing that I want to show you guys is something called expansion, right? We have this default here, right? Which means we're not creating any expansions. We have something called a flexible, which means that, well, if you need to take up the space, take it. But if you don't need to take it, don't take it. And then the last one is this expansion here, which means that regardless of what the situation is, make sure you take up the max amount of space, right? I call this one greedy here, where this one is not greedy, okay? So this is the first thing, and this is something that you're going to be using all the time, especially, well, only really when you're dealing with direct children of rows and columns. Otherwise, you're not going to have access to this feature. And this is something you may have noticed, is that sometimes you see this expansion, but if I go somewhere here, for instance, this column here, I no longer see this expansion because this is a child of container. Whereas if I go to this container, I see this expansion because this is a child of column. So children of columns and rows, you have this nice expansion because these are flex widgets, okay? And so as a result, we can go to the second one here, and we have a row, and we have a container, Now, if I expand it, if I go to a different resolution, look what we have. We have this container expanding all the way while this one is taking a little bit of space. And the reason for that is because this first container has an expansion factor, whereas this one does not. So this one remains at default state, whereas this one now has a constraint, basically take up the rest of the space. That's a constraint. That's a type of a constraint, right? If I remove this right here, look what happens. If I remove this, now we have an overflow issue, right? Of course, if we come over here, it gets displayed, but here it's an overflow issue, right? And so as a result, what you can do is, depending on your specific use case, you can set both of these as expanded, and they're going to be taking up exactly 1/2 of the row, okay? You can do something else. You can also give it a flex factor. So like something like 2 will take 2/3, right? It's going to take two times as before, right? So if I have 1 by default, it's going to do 1. If I do something like 3, it's going to take 3, right? It's basically, this is 1 now, and this is 3 pieces, right? So if I come back to this one here, this is 1. If I say 2, now it's going to be like 2 of these and 3 of these, right? So that way, whenever you're dealing inside of a row or inside of a column, you have this really powerful capability to align those elements exactly how you want to align them, right? So if I change this back to 1 and change this back to 1, they're going to be taking up exactly 50% of the row where they're in right now, okay? Now, the next thing that I want to show you is a wrap right here, okay? So if you take a look here, we have a wrap, and a wrap does exactly what it says. By default, it displays elements horizontally, right? Or, what direction you specify. By default, it's horizontally, right? So if the elements inside of a wrap, so we have these two containers, they can fit, given the screen width, given the viewpoint, it's not going to wrap. It's going to behave like a list. Whereas on the other hand, if they do not have space, we are going to be wrapping, okay? And so this is another really nice widget that has its own constraints, very unique constraints, meaning that it checks to see that the widgets are not going to be overflowing your screen and will wrap them automatically for you, right? So this is going to be very, very handy in all kinds of situations. Because if you're dealing with a regular row, you need to worry about this expansion factor. Whereas if you're dealing with a wrap, you don't need to worry about that expansion factor. It does it for you, right? You're getting that logic for free, essentially, right? So if I have this, let's say I have a wrap, I have two containers, I'm going to add another container. Well, guess what? If I come over here, they're not going to overflow, right? They're not going to overflow. Well, let me add another one. Okay, that's not going to overflow, but now they're overflowing, right? And so if I go back to my phone view, they're going to overflow. Just two are going to overflow, right? Because these containers, they have a fixed width and height, right? And that is what a container is. It has, a fixed size. And that size needs to be respected, not in all situations, as you're going to see in a little bit, but in this case, it is respected, right? A wrap respects it, because a wrap looks at the children and says, well, your size is this, it's too big, we're going to have an overflow, so I'm just going to wrap the elements, I'm just going to push them down. Whereas if we come here, we can get 4 of them in a line before we need to wrap them, because this one is not going to fit, right? So wrap is trying to figure out how many of these elements I can fit before I need to wrap. Whereas if we go into the desktop, well, guess what? We can fit all of them, right? So a wrap is very, very powerful, right? So in some situations, instead of dealing with a row and having all of these factors and worrying about whether they fit or not fit, you can simply use a wrap because it's so nice and so responsive. Now, if we run this app, and we take a look at what's happening here, you can see that we have a bottom overflow by 45 pixels. Now, of course, if we have a bigger screen, we no longer have that overflow. So for instance, on a tablet view, we do not have an overflow, whereas if we go to a desktop, well, once again, we have an overflow because we do not have enough in this direction, right? In this top-down direction. And why is that? Well, if we go back to our app over here, we are using a column here. And that is because when you start a new page, you automatically have a column here. Now, the problem here is that this column is not scrollable. So we need to allow scrolling, and that will fix the issue. Okay, so now if we reload, we create a scrollable column. And now we're no longer going to have that overflowing issue, right? We're gonna have the same behavior working in all kinds of resolutions, because now the user needs to scroll, right? So here we are, come back over here, and now we can scroll, okay? So this is another thing that you have to keep in mind, is that if you're going to be using columns, and you probably are going to be using columns, right? They're pretty ubiquitous. You need to think about the scrolling behavior here, okay? All right, so let's jump to the next example here, okay? So here, I'm going to be talking about something called responsive columns. And this is very, very useful if you're building like a Kanban board, if you're building like, a to-do app where the user is going to be dragging various items from one status to another. Now, take a look at this scenario here, right? So I have I have a column here, then I have a row, and then I have 3 more columns, as you can see, right? I have 3 more columns giving me this nice behavior here, okay? So if we are talking about just a phone, right? A phone, a screen that phones have, right? This initial resolution here. Well, we can easily get it to work, right? So for instance, we can go to this column here, and what we can do is we can set a padding to it. So if I set like a padding of 20, you see how it expands it. So I'm going to go to this column and maybe make it a padding of 20. and maybe go to this column and make it a padding. Okay, perfect. So that looks fairly nice, right? That looks pretty good, right? So if we run this app right here, let's go ahead and reload this. It's going to look really nice on an iPhone, right? Because we've created 3 columns and we placed them equally on the screens. And so if you take a look at the screen, you can see that these columns are pretty good, right? They take up like a third. Each of these 3 columns pretty much takes a third, more or less, right? But if we jump into a tablet, guess what? We have a problem, right? These are not responsive, right? And same thing with a desktop. Look at this. And that is because the width is not dependent on the screen width, right? The width of each columns. And that is an issue because you don't want to build apps like that, right? You don't want to build apps just for phones or apps just for tablets or apps just for desktops. You want your apps to be responsive. And so how do we fix it? The right way is the following, right? So what we can do is we can go to the column, and because they are direct descendants of row, we can simply set this expansion on each of these columns, right? So we can set an expansion, we can set an expansion, we can do that right here, and then we can remove the padding. The padding is not good because it's fixed padding, right? We can simply remove the padding here. We can do that right here. And now if we come over here, you can see that it is now responsive. Okay, so we don't have padding. We are not, using padding to align them. And same thing in the desktop view, right? They're fully responsive. Okay, so how do we fix it? Well, because all of these columns are direct descendants of a row, we can simply use this expansion right here. And we can kind of work with this expansion. We can use a flex factor here to arrange them differently. But in most scenarios, all you need to do is this expansion right here. And as a result, very quickly and very easily, we have a responsive layout, okay? Now, the issue that you're going to be having is whenever you have variable number of columns, right? So right here, we have 3 columns. And we know this before we, run the app. We know in advance, right? But in many situations, we may not know the number of columns in advance, meaning that we might have 2 columns, we might have 3 columns, we might have 10 columns. We just do not know, okay? And so this is fairly common. You're going to be dealing with this all the time. And so in this example here, we have the same scenario, but now we are using variable number of columns, right? So here I have a page state variable called a status list, and here I have 3 statuses. Okay, now this can be set here, or it can be set as part of the app. It doesn't really matter because our UI is going to reflect it. Okay, and so now if I go ahead and run this app, you can see that with 3 statuses, we have 3 columns perfectly aligned. And if we jump over here, you see they're perfectly aligned. If we jump over here, they're perfectly aligned. Now, if I go ahead and add another item here, now, like I said, it doesn't really matter if I do it here or it's done while the app is running, the behavior is going to be the same. So if I say something like recheck and I say confirm, now we have 4 columns, I rebuild the app, we should have the same behavior with 4 columns correctly laid out for us. All right, so now if we come back, you can see that we have 4 columns, okay? And so we can do this, we can view them in a tablet, we can go to a desktop view, and we still do not have any issues. Now at this point, you may be thinking that this is fairly simple to do. It's going to be done just like this previous example here with these expansions here. Well, actually, it's a little bit more trickier than that, right? So if we take a look at this page here, we still have our initial column, we have that row, but now instead of a list of columns, we have a list view because now our list of columns is dynamic. They are being generated from a list. And so we need to create a list view. But once we create a list view, that column is now a child of a list view. It's no longer a child of the row. And so if that, if that column was here, we no longer have access to that expansion. Okay, so now we need to do something else. We need to wrap this column in a container because by default, columns and rows do not have any constraints, right? But we need to place constraints on that. And as a result, this column here, we need to wrap it in a container, okay? And this container is gonna have a width that would be set dynamically, okay? So if you click on this container, we have here a width that is set dynamically via a code expression. And what does this code expression accomplish? Well, it's very, very simple. We take a number of items, which means the number of columns, and we take the current screen width. And then what we do is we take the screen width and we divide it by the number of columns. And what we have as the result is the width of the individual column. And so if we have like 2 columns, it's going to be the screen width divided by 2, which is like, 50% here, 50% there. If we have 3 columns, it's divided by 3. If we have 10 columns, it's going to be divided by 10. And so now we have a variable here that we can set as the width of this column here, right? So remember, a column cannot have its own constraints. A column is like, it doesn't care, about its children's constraints, and it doesn't care about its own. It just expands, infinitely, right? Same thing for rows. And so what we need to do is we need to wrap it in a container and give that container very, very specific constraints. And so as a result, now when we run the app, as you just saw, we get this expansion. We get this expansion with a variable number of columns, all thanks to this custom code expression that's dependent on the width, dependent on the number of columns. Okay, so this is another scenario that you can use. Let's go ahead and check out another example here. Okay, so here we have a grid view. Okay, now grid view does exactly what it says. It creates a grid. Okay, so whereas a wrap, wraps it if necessary, a grid view will always be a grid view. Okay, it's not going to be, it doesn't really depend on the screen width. It doesn't really depend if it needs to be a grid view, just like a wrap. A grid view has, stricter constraints, if you will. In this grid view here, we have 4 items here, right? 4 project cards, right? So if I collapse this, you can see that we have a grid view and we have 4 of these. Now, these items will get displayed no matter what. It's always going to be a grid view. This grid view, right? So if we come over here and we say it's a vertical, it's a cross-axis count, we have this spacing. We set this. It's always going to be a grid view no matter what, right? So if we come over here, we still have this grid view. But the issue here is that we have these containers, right? These cards here, they get expanded in weird ways. And that is because a grid view tells its children, look, you're going to expand as much as you need to expand. Okay, so if we have a mobile view, you're going to be taking, this amount. If we have a tablet, you're going to be taking, a bigger amount, right? If we have a desktop view, you're going to be taking a lot. And so, these cards expand, but the stuff inside no longer looks natural, right? Because it's not responsive, right? And so regardless of the resolution, this grid view is not going away. It's not going to, create, a bunch of these this way, a bunch of these that way. It has very, very strict constraints. And so in this case, if we are dealing with grid views, we need to be very careful and see exactly what's happening inside these grids, these cards, and make sure that they're responsive, okay? So let me show you a couple of things that you can do. The first thing that you can do is you can create a wrap, okay? A wrap is more responsive. It's more response friendly, okay? So here's the same cards in a wrap instead of a grid view, right? So in this scenario, they are wrapping, but if we come over here, this is kind of what they look like, okay? You can see this is kind of what they are. And if we come over here, this is kind of what they are. So they're all centered, and depending on your screen, they may wrap, they may display the whole thing. This is one scenario, okay? Now, another thing that you can do is you can change the font to scale up and down depending on your screen size. So if we come over here, we have this example here, and you can see it looks pretty good, right? And this layout looks pretty good. And that is because we started building it in kind of this mobile friendly layout. Okay, and so if I expand it, you can see that now the font scales up. Okay, in this one, it still remains the same here, but you can see it now scales up. If I come over here, it scales up even more. Okay, now you may need to kind of work on the scaling here, and I will show you exactly how it's done. But at least the font more or less looks decent in this huge scaled by the grid view, in this container here that was scaled by the grid view. And so what we now have here is this, for the font size, we have a code expression. And what we're taking is the screen width and multiplying it by 0.05. Okay, and that is just a number that I chose. You can tweak it depending on your scenario. So for instance, let's make it 0.03 so it doesn't scale as much. We're gonna check this. We're gonna confirm and reload our app and take a look at this new font scaling. All right, so now if you jump over here, you see this is the initial size here, and here's the new size, right? And these are the original sizes, right? So this looks decent now. At least to me, to my eyes, it looks pretty decent. If we expand it here, this is how it looks. It looks pretty decent. Looks pretty decent here. And so this is something else that you can do, right? Especially with grid views that set very, very firm constraints on their children, right? Because a grid view is like basically saying, I don't care, about what you have inside as a child, but I'm gonna stay a grid view no matter what, which means I'm gonna stretch you out. And so in this scenario, you need to be worrying about, expanding this, right? So you may need to expand the button. You may need to change the size of the button, right? So for instance, this button here, what do we have? We scroll down, we don't have a width, right? So this is a default width, but we may need to set a width. Okay, so for instance, we might need to come over here, paste this, and depending on the screen size, right, we may need to multiply it by something. So let's say I multiply it by 0.05. This button here, let's go ahead and rebuild this and see how it looks. All right, and now as you can see, it's fairly small, right? Because this font is like 10, so the width is 10. And what we want is width of 100. So maybe we can come over here and we can multiply it by 0.5, right? We can multiply the whole thing by 10. And we need to do a check for errors, hit confirm, come back out, rebuild this. All right, come back here. And this is kind of what we see. Okay, so now that is too long. So we need to tweak it, but that button will grow. That button will grow as appropriate. Actually, let's see if we can tweak it. Maybe 0.25 is too big. Let's do half of that. How about that? 0.25. 0.5 is too big. What about half of that? Hopefully that will look better. In fact, yeah, maybe this is going to be the right one. Let's go ahead and rebuild this. All right, here we are. Come back over here. And this is the button. Let's go ahead and expand it. And look at this. So now it's a little bit better. It looks good here. It looks good here. It looks good here. It looks decent here. And it looks decent here. We just need to maybe adjust the height the same way, right? Because now we're just stretching it horizontally. We may also increase the height. Okay, so that is one way that you can create responsive layouts when you have very, very strict constraints. And when you want to retain this grid view, right? So obviously another scenario is to have this wrap, right? Then you don't really need to worry about these things here, right? But if you're not, if you want that grid view, you need to worry about what you have inside, because those things need to be scaled appropriately. Last but not least, I want to show you a technique that is universal, which means that you can use this technique everywhere if you'd like. And so if we come over here, we have a grid view, but we also have a wrap as well. Okay, and that is because we have conditional visibility, right? With some screen sizes, we're going to be displaying a grid view. With others, we're going to be displaying a wrap. And so if I go ahead and take a look at this app over here, so in the mobile view, we are seeing a familiar grid view. But if you go to a tablet view, we're no longer seeing a grid view. We are seeing a wrap. This is a wrap, right? Because a grid view would have been 2 by 2. This is a wrap. And if we go into a desktop view, we're still seeing a wrap. And that is because we have conditional visibility. So this grid view only gets activated when the screen width is less than or equal to our breakpoint small. Okay, and I'm going to be covering that in just a little bit. Whereas a wrap is going to be activated when the screen width is greater than breakpoint small. Okay, so if we click over here, we can see these breakpoints, right? So if I come over here and I type break, you can see inside constants, we have 3 breakpoints. We have small, medium, and large. And what is a breakpoint? Well, a breakpoint is a specific number, right? It's a specific level at which we have an activation of different behaviors, right? So a breakpoint small is a mobile view, a phone view. Medium is like tablets, right? It's going to be from one size to another. Okay, and we don't have to worry about the size because this is all taken care of for us. And a large is going to be a desktop view. So what you can do is when you're building the app, you can compare the current screen size against these breakpoints and then take appropriate action. So you don't need to really worry about, what is the width of a phone, what is a width of a tablet, because there's, multiple phones, there's multiple tablets. You just need one variable to compare it to. And that is what's so nice about these breakpoints here. So here I'm just comparing this breakpoint small, and I'm just worrying about one layout, which is my mobile phone layout. Okay, I just want to get that grid view. Otherwise, if it's a tablet or a desktop, I'm gonna go with a wrap. Okay, and this is obviously just as an example. I don't know if this is gonna be the right approach for this kind of app. In fact, it could be, because we no longer need to worry about getting these cards working, right? Because now we don't have to worry about all of this, because when we run our app in bigger, for bigger resolutions, we keep these cards. We now just have a wrap, right? We don't have to worry about, dealing with the text and scaling and all of these issues like we had to do before, right? So maybe this is the right approach. If you do not need a grid view in all scenarios, this may be the right approach because it is easier, right? It is easier, right? So, for instance, in a desktop view, we just simply display a row. In a, here we display a grid view, right? We don't have to worry about scaling the text and the buttons and all of that. So this is another scenario, right? And so now that I've shown you different ways, different scenarios, different techniques, different things that you have in your arsenal, that you have at your disposal to help you build responsive apps, let's go ahead and create a responsive version of this page right here. So here we have a page here, and if we jump here, you can see that it's not really responsive, right? It doesn't take up the whole screen. It just doesn't look good in resolutions that are greater than breakpoint small, right? So if we come over here to tablet or desktop, even worse. Okay, and so let's go ahead and fix this up so that it works equally well in all kinds of scenarios. Okay, so the first thing that I want to look at is this column right here. So we have this column here, and inside the column we have a list view. Now this list view is horizontal, which means that depending on the number of items, it's gonna just expand. Okay, now remember, with a column we have unlimited size, which means that we need to constrain it somewhere. Okay, so you either need to constrain it in a list view, or you need to wrap that list view in a container and constrain that. Well, thankfully, this list view here has this expansion here, okay? Because if I remove that expansion, I'm gonna get an error, right? It's basically telling me that this column, allows as much as you want, and the list view is gonna create as many, as much as it wants as well. So we need to constrain it, right? So this is one way of constraining it. Another way that you can constrain it using this shrink wrap here. Okay, so this is another thing that you can do over here. Okay, so this is fine. Okay, so the next thing that I want to take a look at is this one here. So this current route, this scenario here, because if we expand it, this one doesn't expand, right? It's kind of next to each other, and we have a couple of issues here. So if we take a look at this row here, and we have this icon here, we want this icon to be, expanded. We want it to be like right here. And so what we can do is we can take a look at this row here, and what we can do is we can expand this row. use maximum amount of size on the main axis. So if you click here, you see how it expands, okay? Now it expands and now it respects this alignment here, okay? So we're basically saying, take up the entire row, take up the entire, as much as you can. And here we can control how we want to align it, right? And the best scenario is going to be this one right here. And so now if we come over here, this thing is all the way at the end, which is exactly what we want. Okay. Now we also need to do the same thing here. Okay. So here we have a row and we have two columns. Okay. And these columns here are right next to each other. We don't want that, right? We want it to be kind of spread out. And so if we take a look at the columns, what we can do is we can have this expansion, right? Because they're direct children of the row, right? So I'm going to do this expansion here. It expands. And we're going to do the same expansion here. Okay, we're going to come here. And now they're going to be taking up exactly 1/2 each because we have two columns. And so if we come over here, you see now it's much nicer. Okay, now obviously we can also do centering here. We can center this column, right? We can come to this column. We can also center it here. But I think this looks a lot better, right? Kind of this left justified. Okay, so moving right along, we have the same scenario here with this icon, right? So if we click on this text, scroll down, we can see that we have this row and we have to give it maximum amount of size on the main axis. And we need to make sure that this is selected, which is correct. And now it looks a lot better. Next, if we jump to this row here, we can see that this row is fully expanded, but we have this thing here. Now, this thing, I want it to be at the end, right? And so in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do expansion here, right? I want this to be expanded, right? So I'm going to click here and that's going to move it all the way, pushing this towards the end. And I'm going to do the same thing here, right? I'm going to do this row full. That's going to expand it. I'm going to jump here, do the exact same thing, expand it. That looks a lot better. And this is now responsive, okay? And it looks really nice in the mobile view. It looks really nice in the other views as well. Now, moving right along, we have this chart, and we want this chart to take up the entire width. Now, this chart is actually part of this row right here, okay? And so we won't be able to expand it. It's not like a row, right? This is not going to work. But what we can do is we can set an unlimited width on it, okay? And that is because we are constrained by this recent activity. We have a container, right? This container has a constraint. So we're not going to have any issues expanding this right here, this chart, right? So I can simply click here and that's going to expand it all the way. Okay, and as a result, we have this infinite width here. This expands all the way. This is part of this column here, and this is part of this container here. Okay, and then this container is part of this column here. Okay, and so because it's part of a container, it has these constraints which allow us to expand it as much as it needs to be expanded. And as a result, we have a really nice responsive page that looks really nice in all kinds of scenarios, right? So in this mobile view, in this view, in that view, looks really, really nice and clean. And so using the techniques that I talked about in today's video, you can create any kind of an app to be responsive across different screens, different devices, anywhere from a mobile view to a tablet, desktop, etc., etc. It's going to behave exactly the same no matter how the person is using it. So they can be using it on a phone in the morning, on a tablet in the afternoon, and using the web version or the desktop version in the evening to do something else. And they're going to have the same layout that they came to expect regardless of the device that they're using it on. Now, I talked about lots of different things in today's tutorial. And if you've been paying attention, then you're already ahead, right? You're going to be able to create beautiful, responsive UI designs. But if you're truly serious about building responsive apps, then you owe it to yourself to get access to this app right here and to see exactly how I built this app, to see exactly what's happening behind the scenes and test it out. Try different things, try different scenarios and see how, FlutterFlow and Flutter responds. And you can do just that by viewing this app and or cloning it and adding it to your own collection of apps. And you'll be able to do just that when you join our amazing Patreon community, because when you become a member of our incredible Patreon community, you're not only going to get access to this app, which is amazing as well, because by learning this app, by understanding it, you'll be able to eventually master responsive UI design, which is very, very powerful and very, very important as well. You're also going to get access to my other apps that I've done tutorials about before. All kinds of apps, from very, very simple apps to complex production ready apps. They're all there. They're all waiting for you to view and or clone. Plus, you can ask questions about these apps. You're going to get support from our community. I'm also there trying to help out as best as I can. And you're also going to get access to extra content, our Q&As, behind the scenes content, all kinds of amazing content that I do not publish on my public YouTube channel. And last but not least, when you join our amazing Patreon community, you're going to be supporting the channel and supporting my work. And so if you're getting any value from the content that I'm putting out, hopefully, you're interested in kind of taking this whole thing to the next level and supporting my work. And you'll be able to do just that when you become a member of our Patreon community. And so if any of this sounds like, it's going to provide you with some level of value, that you're going to be able to take your no-code knowledge to the next level and learn more things and build better apps, then you can join our amazing Patreon community via the first link in the description below the video.